All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started again. This is talk number 2, a unique approach to threat analysis mapping. And our presenters now are on the threat intel team with CERT, right up over the hill here. I introduce to you Deana Shick and Kyle O'Meara. They're going to do a full introduction of themselves.
Hello. Oh, I will make sure to avoid that. Okay. How's everybody doing? Enjoying B-side so far? Excellent. Okay. All right, so we are here today because we are presenting on a paper that Kyle and I wrote and published about a month ago. So everything we are going to talk about today is available to you because our goal in this was to create something that was actionable so other people can take it with them and use it. So I just want to ask a question to everybody in the audience. And so how many of you guys reverse engineer malware? Can I get a show of hands? Okay. How many of you guys do incident response or are part of a SOC? Okay. How many of you guys do both? Anybody? One person. Excellent. 2 people. All right. Okay. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So my name is Deana Shick, and I work at the Software Engineering Institute CERT Coordination Center. I am on the threat intelligence team with Kyle O'Meara, and I've been working at CERT now for about 3 years. Prior to this, I did export compliance and ITAR regulations stuff before I got my master's at Carnegie Mellon, and I've been there ever since.
Like Deana said, I'm Kyle. I've been at CERT now for a little bit over a year, and before that, I was with FireEye, and if there are any Govies in here, I worked in the Sharks Here program, basically ran that. And then before that, I was at NSA full-time before that. So, but it's exciting to be here at CERT. I'm back in Pittsburgh. I went to school in this area, so it's good to be back in this area.
So we're on the threat intelligence team, and our overall directorate consists of some malware, reverse engineers, some network engineers, and then the threat intelligence team that puts it all together. We recently merged with our vulnerability team, so Dan, who just spoke, and a couple of our vulnerability researchers are out there in the crowd. So now we have a really interesting access to different types of data that we didn't necessarily have before. And that's kind of how this all started. We do produce a whole lot of tools. Our malware team produces reverse engineering tools and other static analysis tools. And these are available on our GitHub site, and you guys can use them, and you can always ask us any questions. We might not be able to answer them, but we can certainly field them to the right people.
And that's up there because some of the tools we use to do our analysis are available out there.
Okay. So I asked you guys a question of what you guys do. So we have malware and people that do malware analysis, people that do incident response, and then you have people that are doing network analysis, but rarely do people kind of put them all together. And in the industry right now, you can go out and you can read CrowdStrike reports or FireEye reports or what have you, and typically these take an inside-out approach to understanding the adversary. So what that means is I have a network. That network has been hosed by a bad guy, and I start my analysis with that data. Our team does not do incident response, but we have a really good idea of what type of malware is out there. So we wanted to flip this on its head a little bit and start with the tools that adversaries are using instead of more fragile indicators of compromise like domain names, IP addresses, and so forth. We do have a malware artifact catalog that has about 200 million pieces of malware in it, and we've been looking at trends across that now for the last 10 to 12 years minimum. We also have what's called our knowns process. So our reverse engineers will get an exemplar of malware, they will reverse engineer it, and they will find all of the related pieces of malware, and we call that a family. So our analysis is really going to start with how we understand a malware family. And what we have is a configuration dumper, a bunch of Youre signatures. The configuration dumper will then give us all of the other indicators of compromise so we can put together the entire picture, or I guess a more complete picture of an intrusion instead of just one piece of it. The other challenge problem that we have in the industry is that different security vendors like to name things differently. So you have people calling different groups A, B, C, D, E, F, and there's nobody putting them together, nor is anybody really confirming the findings. There's a lot of circular reporting, and frankly, we just got kind of annoyed with that and decided that we were going to tackle this, at least tackle it in terms of malware. And all of this spurred this paper, and the goal of it is to just put all of the different types of indicators together to tell a more complete picture using an outside-in methodology instead of an inside-out methodology. So I guess kind of talking about what that really means. So our goal was to utilize the data that we have in-house. So our vulnerability stuff, we have an exploit catalog, malware catalog, and a whole bunch of network stuff to help net defenders and those in the intelligence community. So everything that we produce in this report is public to you, but also we want to teach you how to phish to some degree so you can take anything that you might find and reapply it back into your network. Let's see. And I think I kind of went over a lot of this. We do utilize indicator expansion, and I just want to explain that really quickly, and that is the process of going from IP address to domain name, or domain name back to IP address, or anything along those lines. So any of those steps that you take, we call indicator expansion. So the data that we used, or we tried to use, so we certainly scoured the internet for all of the case studies that we were going to talk about. We're going to talk about one. But first we used our malware family analysis, of course, and then the second biggest piece of data that we used was Farsight's passive DNS database. Has anybody used that here? Anybody use passive? Okay, Evan, excellent, there's one. And we attempted to use blacklists. So again, there are a lot of security vendors that produce a whole bunch of blacklists, and we intersected all of our IOCs for the malware families that we looked at, and we found that there was little to no overlap on any of the blacklists. It says to me that unless you have that blacklist at a particular time, you might have some coverage if you're implementing them, but you probably won't when it comes to, I guess, when it comes to adversary tooling, and that was just not helpful at all.
We also use the MITRE CV database to identify those and CV details as well. Exploit DB, obviously, and then other open source information such as Twitter, blogs, vendor articles, and you guys haven't checked out the circle.lu malware information sharing platform. It's pretty useful. There's lots of information there. You can kind of get an account if you're a cert or a vendor, and you don't really have to contribute, but you can contribute. But there's a lot of good information in there. Some of the tools we use, obviously, were Youre. One of the tools that was developed in-house by our developers is function of Youre. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about the code comparison section. Silk, which if anybody not know what Silk is, and it was developed in-house years ago. I'll let Deana talk. She knows more about it.
Does anybody here not know what Silk is? Okay. So Silk is a network monitoring tool for very, very large networks. And I think George could probably explain it better than I can.
It's a network flow analysis tool used by CERT. It's free and open source.
Yeah, you can find it online. It's downloadable. Just search for Silk and you can download it and use it.
So instead of keeping a whole bunch of PCAP, you would then use Silk to analyze your network flow. We use Silk in a little bit of a different way because you can make what's called prefix maps. So that would map like an IP address to an AS, for example, like an ASN, and do really, really fast analysis. It also builds IP sets, which is helpful if a client or sponsor gives you a bunch of net blocks and you have to build them yourself.
And just some scripts for automation purposes.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to go over our methodology a little bit. And in our paper, we went through 3 different case studies of actor tools. The first was the Smallcase malware, the second was Derusbi, and the third was Sakula. So, like I said, a lot of reporting that you'll read into OSINT will start with the incident data, and you'll work your way out to try and understand how an intrusion works. So we are starting with our knowns, and in particular with the data that comes from our configuration dumpers. And this gives us an MD5 of all of the files, IP addresses, domain names, any strings, ports, remote files, etc. We then, after starting here, you then map out to all of the other data sets. So you can find additional C2 infrastructure by using Farsight's passive DNS database. You can search OSINT for incident data, which is helpful at least so it can tell you that a piece of malware has been involved in an incident. And then you can pivot to the vulnerability that was used in the exploit. These are in no particular order. The only thing that we chose to start with were our knowns. But everything else you can kind of do, it's more circular. So you can use one of the data sets to inform the others. The one circle that we left out of here was so going from exploit to exploit kit. We did not look at it for these case studies, but it's certainly a future work area. So does that make sense to everybody? Are we all on board here? Excellent. So what were some of our results? So again, this is an example of Derusbi, starting with the configuration dumper, using the Farsight's passive DNS database to find additional C2 infrastructure, so IP addresses, domain names. We then used the MD5 hashes of the Derusbi malware to find incident data, which there was a lot of, thankfully. Well, maybe not thankfully, but at least for my purposes. We then found certain CVEs that were similar vulnerabilities were used, and then, of course, you found the exploit that was taking advantage of the vulnerability.
And what's kind of the highlight here is that we're not just saying like, oh, this is the exploit used. Like I actually dug around until I actually found the exploit itself, or if it was already on exploit DB as a proof of concept or something like that. So we actually have the exploits themselves, or supposedly, right?
But it's also interesting because the exploit piece is actually the hardest piece, and I think that this is a community gap area that I think that we can work on. I'm not sure many people are really collecting and looking at exploits, but we are certainly trying to. Okay, so what is Derusbi? So this is used by certain APT actors that compromised OPM, Anthem Health, Forbes.com. What name that they were used, that Symantec and everybody used? Can't remember, it's in a different slide. We assert that the attacker tool was created in 2006 and there was a major rewrite in the code. I'm not sure when that happened, but in a couple slides we'll show you that there was a pretty big spike in the collections of Derusbi malware. So what's really important is in OSINT, some people have claimed that Derusbi is another malware family called Cadoso, and beyond that, some have asserted that Derusbi is also Briba. And what has happened is once one person says these things, other people pick up on it, and they're like, yeah, definitely, this is definitely Cadoso. I think Palo Alto went as far as to call the actor group using Briba the Cadoso group, and that was only because there was a string in the malware that said Cadoso. It was not the same malware, but we wanted to look into that to verify some of those claims because we weren't finding people that were actually doing that.
So for the code comparison, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about our function Youre tool, so on how that works, and that's what I use to do a lot of this. So the tool that's available out there on the CMU SCI GitHub is under the Pharos tool is function Youre. So how it works is that it creates a function for any executable creates a Youre rule for every function in an executable. Now you might say, well, that's going to give you good functions, bad functions, right? Then you bang it against a known clean directory. So I would bang it against a known clean system32 directory to then remove any hits that occur. And then I have a subset of rules after I do some frequency analysis that I can say that all these rules from this specific malware that we know is to be this malware, that these rules are malicious rules. So what I did then was I'm like, well, then I want to compare Derusbi to Briba and Derusbi to Cardoso. And by doing that, determine like how common are these malware families that supposedly in open source are saying that they're all equal, they're all the same, whatever. Well, based on doing this analysis and looking at these collection numbers of what we have in house, right? So based on starting with Cardoso and doing the frequency analysis, I came with a rule set that I had, and then when I compared those rules and how many rules actually hit on Derusbi, I found only one function in common with 4 files, and another function was common with 11. So that's showing you that only 2 functions out of this huge rule list that I had were found to be common in both malware sets. So, similarly with the Derusbi and the Briba, they only shared 7 functions, right? So you can see how, based on doing further analysis and looking at the code itself, that these files are not the same. This malware is not the same, and from that angle. So that's why, and then one of the other things is that you don't see a comparison to Briba and Cardoso. That's in the paper itself, but that's a different set that we're looked at, because this is, as we talked about, we're only going to give you one of the 3 use cases that we did, and this is talked about Derusbi. Does that kind of make sense? So function Youre is out there. You can use it. It's kind of good for SOCs or incident responders when they're trying to get quick hits on things. But like I said, you have to take it and pare down your set before you can actually have a good high confidence that set you have is a good Youre set that will hit and only fire on malicious rules.
So what were some of our findings? So we're going to go through each piece and then kind of put it together to derive some conclusions. So we had 112 files of Derusbi as of January 2016. We have not collected any more Derusbi since this date. As of yesterday, I read a report that we put out. Within the configuration dump, there were 58 unique domain names used for C2 and only 5 IP addresses. The malware is communicating over some pretty common ports, so that's not really too interesting. I guess it's just an extra data point. And it did have some remote files and some interesting strings, including CIA.exe, mgame, routeprint, pom.jpg. None of this is super interesting, but this is the kind of information that you can find if you are looking at a piece of malware and you are writing a configuration dumper to better understand the malware, which is cool. And I'm not sure most incident responders are taking this and implementing it. Well, network defenders are implementing it. So we saw a huge spike in the compile times in 2012, and as a lot of us know, these things can be easily changed. Again, this is just a data point that take these types of things with a grain of salt. I'm not sure what accounts for the spike from 2011 to 2012, so if anybody has any ideas, please see me later, and we can talk about it. So after doing some indicator expansion, we found 60 more domain names associated with the malware, 50 IP addresses. But the interesting thing is that we found that all of the infrastructure only used 12 different name servers. We also looked into different records, like the SOA record, which could tell you more about the person that was registering the domain, among other details. We didn't find any information in the SOA records, and we found that the only MX records were variants of yahoo.jp, which is different, not necessarily expecting that. So who owns or who is responsible for these IP addresses? So these are the organizations, and the way that we got to this data was we took the IP addresses, found the autonomous system numbers, and then found the organizations that have the autonomous systems. So Unicom China had the most IP addresses, and you see some others sprinkled in here, including Confluence, which comes up quite a few times, Amazon, which is not terribly surprising because it's pretty big. But the interesting thing is that Joe's data center came up, and one of our colleagues at CERT is presenting it first, I think, next week, or whenever first is, about identifying public sinkholes. So we know that Joe's data center is running, they are running sinkholes there for certain types of malware. So this is what the network looks like.
So the other data point we're talking about is incident data. So think of that as public reporting in itself. You know, you have your who's who of doing the reporting, CrowdStrike, you know, Symantec, Cisco, and so forth, right? So Derusbi was tied to these different names. It was tied to Deep Panda. It was tied to Kung Fu Kitten. You know, it was involved with the breach. You know, supposedly tied to the breach of OPM. Derusbi is only one part of this rat itself. It's actually the kernel level tool, and you know, CrowdStrike also ties it to defense industrial base, you know, attacks as well. And what's interesting is that it also aligned with one of the other use cases we had, ironically, Sakula, but they're actually not similar in itself as well. But even though there's sometimes they tie them to the same way, so that's why we say like it's. Our approach was to start from malware itself, not really trust you know, open source reporting as like the main key area to start from it. The other data point that we mentioned in our nonlinear sort of circle thing was vulnerabilities, right? So Derusbi was known to link via the was linked to these 3 different CVEs. And you know, what was important for me was to actually just find these CVEs. So what kind of happens, or find the exploits tied to these CVEs. But luckily with time, and some of these were older, it makes it easier to find the exploits out there, but it still took a lot of digging. And you have to kind of trust what you're reading, and that's actually going to go and dive into my next slide. But like you have to sort of trust what you're reading and assume that the exploit that you found is actually exploit that's tied to that specific CVE. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes it's not.
I think the other thing to note is just because the CVE is old doesn't mean that it's not relevant. And I think the industry as a whole likes to chase the shiny penny. So you're looking at, oh, this 0 day, that 0 day. But the truth is that the older CVEs are being exploited constantly by exploit kits. And that kind of plays into this analysis too. So just because they're old doesn't mean that they're not relevant.
Which ties into the whole patching thing and updating your systems and so forth. So this next slide was sort of, you know, given the time that's elapsed since our report was completed. You won't find this information here. However, we're working on putting together a different technical report, you know, looking at Flash exploits themselves. But so here are the, you know, some of the tools I use to do this. So why did I dig into this? Because it was something of interest. I was working down a different path, but I was looking at sort of the same CVEs that were found in our report, and then I was, you know, doing through kind of decompressing them and running a couple of these tools. I'm visual, so I kept seeing the same hash appear for a underlying exploit, and I'm like, well, that's tied for the, you know, it was tied to this CVE. Why is it showing up in this one, right? So that's sort of where it kind of led to. So it's kind of like, why is this important, right? So we're sitting here trusting what vendors are saying about, or open source is saying about different exploits, but when you're looking at the actual code, I can 100% tell you, based on this example I had, that's not the case, right? So the exploit that came out for the 2015 8651, which came out at the end of December, it was a 0 day when it came out. It was targeting Flash, obviously. But what was interesting is that that exact same hash was listed to be targeted in the attacks that were going against like this specific hash. But that specific hash, once you broke it down and looked at the actual code, was the exact same exploit that was used a year earlier, and it was tied to the 2014 CVE, right? So like when looking at it, the fact that like we trusted the fact that it was a 0 day, it wasn't the case, because then the other exploit hashes that I had for that one didn't match at all either. So kind of the conclusion is like, what do you trust? Who do you trust? Like, what do you believe when it comes to like these exploits and these CVEs? And you know, like I said, we're doing further analysis in it. I only kind of did the tip of the iceberg here when looking at the stuff, but it was sort of an interesting finding that I had.
So the TLDR here is that Derusbi was used by APT actors named Deep Panda, Shell Crew, what have you. There are thousands of names that drive me nuts. Derusbi is not Cadoso or Briba, which is very important. It's important for a couple of reasons, because if it was Cadoso or Briba, then that would have added back into our analysis set, and we would have had more malware to look at, but it is not. So please do not believe everything that you read. The actors used a very small network compared to some of the other networks that I've looked at. They also, and I think I forgot to bring this up, so one of the ASs, one of the organizations was actually the Taiwanese academic network that was used during CNO, which I thought was kind of interesting. So we can say that, at least to some degree, the actors were probably targeting that organization in some way. The infrastructure uses only 12 name servers, and in at least 2 cases, the group exploited 0-day vulnerabilities. What I want for those of you guys listening is that if you guys are network defenders, please do this analysis, take the data that you find, so the extra domain names, IP addresses, what have you, and implement them to protect yourself. The malware is, like, we can say with certainty what the actors are using in terms of C2 infrastructure, and you don't typically see this type of analysis out there.
Oh yeah, you know, like I said, the 3 CVEs that were used and the exploits themselves. You can find the actual hashes for the exploits in our paper. And you know, it's important to see, you know, the focus on what you actually know and that you actually trust when going forward. Some of the future work, you know, this is just one methodology, right? So this is just the methodology that we used. It's important that you can also kind of pivot your different ways from there. We're just saying that start with that malware that you know, that malware you understand, and spin from there. A couple of the community gap areas themselves is in exploits, right? So it's very retroactive unless you're developing the exploit, right? Like, you don't know about an exploit till it actually happens. If that's not the case, I'd love to talk to you more, because how do you find it out? We actually developed an exploit catalog itself, so we're kind of cataloging exploits, the actual files or hashes or proof of concepts tied to CVEs. And like I said, we're doing a future analysis on like flash exploits, which that can expand into other application exploits themselves. And we can happy to talk about any of that offline.
Okay, so the takeaways for you are that this is an outside-in approach instead of an inside-out approach that allows you to see just more than one aspect of an intrusion. So we talked about vulnerabilities, exploits, malware, C2 infrastructure, and a little bit about the actors. This is important for those of us in the threat intelligence communities too, because we're not necessarily focusing on just one piece. We really wanted to put it together, to put a more complete story together for everybody. What this means for network defenders is that if you go through this methodology and you pivot from one data set to the next, you can then deploy whatever IOCs you find to protect your networks. This also kind of helps us create an adversary profile too. So if we understand that an adversary is using a particular tool, then we can take a look at that and see if there are other tools that they might be using, if there is similar code, and so forth. So our goal was to really start with the tools instead of with incident data, and separately to confirm or deny what you are finding in OSINT. Please don't believe everything you read. And think a little bit harder about how we as a community want to approach the adversary. So we're open for questions.
Final link to our paper there.
So, if I'm a smart adversary, I know that you're tracking my hashes of my functions. Can't I just foil your whole methodology by doing that and changing my CT from time to time, and now you can't track me? So, in other words, you're just tracking the people who aren't smart enough to avoid it.
So the thing is about tracking malware itself is that, unfortunately, we in the world, people are really lazy. So I guess you could have an adversary that changes the code every time it deploys something. But what we found is even like the really advanced actors only change a little bit of the code, which is why we can group malware families, because ultimately people are really lazy. Now you're right, though, that we probably aren't tracking the 1% of the APTs that are doing like some really, really bad things. But I think that's a really hard problem. I'm not sure that anybody really has like a really good solution. But like I said, this is just one methodology, not the methodology to use, of course.
Yeah, I'm just beginning to cover it. The sample of Derusbi, was that from a live infection, or was that just a sample you guys collected?
So we have a collection of different feeds that we've been analyzing now for like 10 to 12 years. So we have a bunch of files that we've looked at just from collection. So we didn't have the incident, if that, like it wasn't like we collected it because we were hosed.
Right.
That makes sense.
Just seeing what the original attack was.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just kind of have a malware set, and it kind of came in through an RFI to say, hey, we found this, can you look at this for us? And then that's where we develop, and we find out we have, we started with 5, and now we have 100, because based on our reverse engineers, based on doing their analysis and how they develop it, they're able to develop and find more samples in our huge bucket of 250 million samples.
First question is basically, so how much time do you have in this analysis? The second actually refers to the first question. I mean, doesn't this needs to be automated in some way? Because, I mean, yes, if you can identify indicators from a particular actor, but at large, I mean, look at this room, I mean, like, we're all not going to be able to do this work. And if we do, the OSINT problem is we don't know whether or not we can trust each other, because we might accidentally associate or whatever else. So, I mean, isn't this really an automation issue?
Automating what?
I mean, I don't know if you can really you can only automate parts of it. You do reverse engineers because you can't automate it, right?
Well, no, but I mean, on the flip side, I mean, in other words, like obviously the process of narrowing down the functions to associate the different things. I mean,
right. Yeah, sure.
Those parts, because obviously to identify an entire grouping, I mean, there are a lot of threat actors, and I mean that's why we have the shortage in this field. So I guess I'm not knocking anything.
No, I understand what you meant by automation.
Yeah, I'm just saying that, I mean, it's very large. If we can't trust the other OSINT, then we're pretty much left to, we need a solution to automate.
I mean, in a sense, we're saying be careful with trusting, right? I mean, because you have to sort of trust, right? Because you're paying for these reports from whomever, right, that develops the reports, and that you're paying to get this feed, and it has MD5s and IP, so you have to sort of trust it, right? But like it's more like if you have your in-house shop and you're developing out, like this is the sort of approach that I would take if I was developing my shop inside out, which is sort of how we do at CERT, right? But we're not giving
like that 100% no.
Anyone doing cleaning of the CVE database for the identical hashes that you mentioned?
Anybody? Sorry, say that one more time.
Anyone doing cleaning of the CVE database for duplicate repetitive hashes.
Not that I'm
aware of, no. You know, I mean, I think it's a lot of trusting, and then like how AVs, if I understand how most AVs work, they like to look at a hash, because like once I ran these files back through, say VirusTotal, right, I upload them back up, they hit on what they said they were supposed to hit on, right, and then it's like, that's not the case, and especially if it's compressed, right, like so if you throw the original file out, it says it's this CVE, then once you decompress it, and then it's saying, no, it's this CVE, you're like, well then you're just going on a hash alone. So I don't know if anybody's scraping it. Evan?
So one comment, one question. I think the notion of furthering the automation piece, developing a tool that goes from a function to Youre converter, by having that tool out there, we can share Youre signatures. So that's certainly a step in the automation process. So there is some contribution there. So the actual question I had was to, so when you were doing your comparison of sort of convincing me that Derusbi is not these other families, the kind of missing convincing piece that I would have liked to see, and I'm curious if you've done, is if so for the overlap, those few functions, 5 out of 40 or whatever, that overlap between Derusbi and those other families, were those overlapping functions found in malware families all across the board, right? That would convince me more. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, no, we did not do that. We did it for like these sets we have. That's something that could go upon. I mean, you kind of have a little more insight to how we work, but to explain to everybody else how we started with these sets and how we were confident in these sets is that we have reverse engineers actually get sample sets that reverse it, create functions, create Youre signatures, then identify other things, and they also create config dumpers to identify, other configs for those same malware families. So that's where we start with. But looking at that overlap of other functions that hit everywhere else, no, but I mean that's something that should be done, right? I mean, because how many common non-associated malware families are using similar functions, right? I mean, code reuse is very common. Why reinvent the wheel?
So the other thing, just to address your question, Evan, is we did take a look. We worked with Will Casey to do his suffix tree analysis too, which confirmed. So one of our data scientists will take the binaries and compare the binaries between different malware families, and we did that. So we did it at the function to Youre level, and then we did it at a lower level, if you will, and it confirmed our findings that they were very, very different. That's in the paper. We just didn't present about it. It's kind of it's not necessarily the easiest thing to discuss.
Okay, so maybe the context of what other families were looked at, because I think if you're doing a suffix tree comparison, it is sort of looking at what parts of the, what overlapping chunks of the code are common, but part of the question with the suffix tree is, part of the question with the suffix tree is basically what I'm saying is with the suffix tree analysis, you may have looked at a few other families, and I guess I'm suggesting that by broadening the scope, for example, to look at the whole catalog, you can help the argument more.
I think that there's a lot of auxiliary things that we can do, and I think you bring up a good point. So this was just kind of the beginning, not necessarily the end.
Right, and kind of like how we got down this path as well too, right? So like the other use cases aren't like this. They're actually more simple. It's just that when we were doing researching, that we were finding that open source was calling Derusbi and Cardoso and Breva the same. That's sort of why we chose to explain this one, right, and then go down that path. But the other two use cases in our paper are a little more simplistic than this is.
I know you had mentioned that people are kind of lazy, so they tend to reuse code, but isn't it simple enough for people just to throw like an opcode randomization step into their build? Like, you see that in the wild at all? Come across anything like that?
I mean, not for these specific examples, but I mean that's not something that's uncommon, right? I mean, but based on once you reverse and understand that, right, you kind of know what to look for, and I think that's something that's anything that's polymorphic, it's gonna cause harder analysis, right? So.
Any other questions? Anybody?
Thanks.
All right, cool, thanks.
Yes, once more, thank you very much, Deana and Kyle. We'll give them speaker gifts. They're wonderful. If you would like a speaker gift yourself, you have to be a speaker. All right? There we go. Thanks again. Round of applause, please. Thank you.